The old bus wheezed to a stop outside the Metropolitan Symphony Hall, and Maria Elena Vasquez stepped onto the sidewalk with her worn leather bag clutched tight against her chest. Inside that bag was everything she owned that mattered. Sheet music she'd copied by hand, a water bottle, and the last $23 to her name. She looked up at the building and felt her stomach flip. The Symphony Hall stretched toward the sky like a marble mountain, all carved columns and golden doors that seemed to whisper about money and tradition. People in expensive coats walked past her without a glance, their shoes clicking on the stone steps like they owned the place. Maria Elena had never seen anything like it. Back home in Riverside, the fanciest building was the community center, where she'd first touched a piano 3 years ago. That piano had been donated by someone who probably never knew how it would change a girl's entire life. She pulled out the crumpled letter from her bag and read it again, even though she'd memorized every word. The audition was supposed to start at 2 o'clock. She'd taken 2 buses to get here, leaving before sunrise and missing a day of work at the music store. Her boss hadn't been happy, but she'd promised to make up the hours. The security guard at the entrance looked her up and down when she approached. Her jeans were clean but old, and her sneakers had seen better days. She didn't look like the other people walking through those golden doors. "I'm here for the piano audition," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The guard checked his clipboard and frowned. "What's your name?" "Maria Elena Vasquez." He ran his finger down the list twice before shaking his head. "There's no audition today. Got canceled this morning." The words hit her like cold water. "Canceled? But I traveled 3 hours to get here." "Sorry, miss. Nothing I can do about it." Maria Elena felt her chest tighten. She'd used her last bit of savings for the bus tickets. She'd told everyone back home about this chance. Her mother had even lit a candle at church and prayed for her success. She stood there on the steps, watching people flow around her like she was invisible. Part of her wanted to cry, but tears wouldn't change anything. Instead, she sat down on a bench outside the building and pulled out her phone to check bus schedules back home. That's when she heard the music. It drifted out from somewhere inside the building, faint but beautiful, a piano playing something she didn't recognize, but it spoke to her anyway. Without thinking, she stood up and followed the sound. The security guard was busy with someone else, so she slipped inside. The lobby was even more impressive than the outside. All marble floors and crystal chandeliers that threw rainbow sparkles on the walls. The music was clearer now, coming from down a hallway marked rehearsal rooms. She walked toward it like she was in a dream. Her sneakers were silent on the thick carpet, and she passed photographs of stern-looking men in tuxedos, probably famous conductors from long ago. The music stopped, and she heard voices. She peeked around a doorway and saw a massive rehearsal room with a grand piano that looked like it cost more than her family's house. A tall man with silver hair was standing next to it, holding sheet music and talking to someone she couldn't see. "The interpretation lacks fire," the man was saying. His accent was slight but noticeable. "Technical perfection means nothing if the soul is absent." Maria Elena stepped back, not wanting to interrupt, but her bag bumped against a music stand. It wobbled and crashed to the floor with a sound like thunder. The silver-haired man turned toward the doorway. His eyes were sharp blue, and when they found hers, she felt like he could see right through her. "And who might you be?" he asked. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I was looking for the audition, but they said it was canceled, and I heard the music, and You just what?" "I followed it." "The music. I'm sorry, I'll go." But as she turned to leave, he said, "Wait." She froze. "You are here for audition, yes? What instrument?" "Piano," she said quietly. He studied her for a long moment. "I am Heinrich Brenner. I conduct this orchestra." "And you are?" "Maria Elena Vasquez." "Well, Maria Elena Vasquez, since you have traveled far enough to follow music through my building, perhaps you would like to show me what you can do." Her heart started pounding. "Right now?"
"Why not?"
"The piano is here, I am here. You are here." He gestured toward the grand piano like he was presenting a gift. Maria Elena looked at the beautiful instrument and felt a mix of excitement and terror. She'd never played on anything like it. The piano at the music store was decent, but this was clearly worth more than most people made in a year. "I don't have any music prepared for audition," she admitted. Brenner walked to a cabinet and pulled out a thick book of sheet music. He flipped through it and pulled out several pages, setting them on the piano's music stand. Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2, you know it? Maria Elena's mouth went dry. She knew the piece, had listened to recordings of it hundreds of times, but had never attempted to play it. It was incredibly difficult, the kind of music that separated real pianists from people who just played piano. I've heard it, she said. Good. Then play it. But I've never played it before. I'd need time to study it, to practice. Brenner's eyebrows went up. You cannot sight read? She felt heat rise in her cheeks. Sight reading, playing music you'd never seen before, was a basic skill for serious musicians. She'd been teaching herself, but she was still learning. I can try, she said. She approached the piano like she was walking toward the edge of a cliff. The bench was the right height, and when she placed her hands on the keys, they felt perfect under her fingers. She'd never touched keys this responsive, this smooth. She looked at the music and took a deep breath. The opening was gentle, almost questioning. She began to play. The first few measures went well. Her fingers found the notes, and the piano responded with a richness she'd never experienced. But as the piece grew more complex, she started to struggle. Her left hand fumbled a passage, and she had to slow down to keep up. But something interesting happened as she played. Even though she was sight-reading and making mistakes, she began to feel the emotion in the music. Rachmaninoff had poured longing and passion into these notes, and somehow that came through her fingers despite her technical limitations. She played for about 2 minutes before Brenner raised his hand. Stop. She lifted her hands from the keys, her heart sinking. She'd failed, just like she'd expected. But when she looked at Brenner's face, she was surprised. He wasn't frowning. Instead, he looked interested. Your technique needs work, he said. Your sight reading is elementary. Your pedaling is inconsistent. Maria Elena nodded, accepting the criticism. But, Brenner continued, you have something that cannot be taught in any conservatory. What's that? He was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right words. You play with your heart on your fingers, he said finally. Most students play the notes. You play the music. Maria Elena didn't know what to say to that. Brenner walked closer to the piano. Tell me, Maria Elena Vasquez, what is your story? How does a young woman with calloused hands learn to make a piano sing? Maria Elena looked down at her hands, suddenly aware of the rough patches on her fingertips and the small scar across her knuckle from changing a tire last month. These weren't the hands of someone who belonged in a place like this. My story isn't very interesting, she said quietly. Brenner pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. I will be the judge of that. Please tell me, she took a breath. 3 years ago, I was working 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and helping my dad with construction during the day. I'd never touched a piano in my life. Then the community center got this old piano donated, and they needed someone to help move it. Her voice got stronger as she continued. When we set it down, one of the keys got pressed and it made this sound. I'd never heard anything like it before, pure and clear, like it was calling to me. The director saw me staring at it and told me I could try it if I wanted. Brenner nodded, encouraging her to continue. So I started going there after work, just pressing keys and trying to figure out how to make music. YouTube videos became my teacher. I'd watch them on my phone and try to copy what I saw. It took me 6 months just to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star properly. And your family? They supported this? Maria Elena smiled sadly. My parents didn't understand at first. They thought it was a waste of time. We needed money, not music. My mother kept saying, pianos don't put food on the table. But my grandmother, she was different. How so? She used to sing old Mexican songs while she cooked. Folk songs her grandmother taught her. When she heard me playing one day, she started crying. She said music was in our blood, that her grandmother had been a musician back in Mexico but never had the chance to really pursue it. Brenner leaned forward slightly. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She died last year, but before she passed, she made my parents promise to let me keep learning. She said maybe I could do what she never could. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Brenner stood up abruptly. Maria Elena, I want to make you an offer. Her heart stopped. What kind of offer? Our season finale is in 4 weeks. It's our biggest concert of the year. Sold out, all the important people in the city will be there. I want you to perform as a guest soloist. The words hit her like lightning. You want me to what? Perform. With the full orchestra, in front of 1,200 people, she felt dizzy. Mr. Brenner, I can't do that. I'm not ready for something like that. I'm just learning. I work at a music store selling guitar picks and sheet music. I'm not a real musician. That is exactly why you should do it, he said firmly. You have something real. Something honest. Most of the pianists who audition for me have been playing since they were children, studying at expensive schools, learning to play exactly like everyone else. You play like yourself, but I'll embarrass myself. And you. And the whole orchestra. Brenner walked to the window and looked out at the city. Let me tell you something about embarrassment. 20 years ago, I was conducting in Berlin. Very prestigious orchestra, very traditional audience. One night, a young violinist made a mistake during a solo, completely forgot his part and had to improvise. The audience was shocked. Some people walked out. He turned back to her. But that improvisation was more beautiful than the original piece. It was real music coming from his heart in that moment. The recording of that concert is still one of my most treasured possessions. Maria Elena shook her head. I can't, it's too much.
What would I even play?
Ah, that is the interesting part. Brenner's eyes lit up. I have been working on something special. A piece that combines classical piano with traditional Mexican folk melodies. It would be perfect for you. You wrote something for me? I started writing it last month before I ever met you. Sometimes music comes to us before we understand why. Now I know I was writing it for you. She felt overwhelmed. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. I need time to think about it, she said. Of course. But while you think, let me show you something. Brenner walked to his briefcase and pulled out a folder of sheet music. The pages were covered with notes, some crossed out and rewritten. Obviously a work in progress. This is what I have so far, he said, setting it on the piano. Would you like to hear how it begins? Before she could answer, he sat down at the piano and began to play. The opening was classical, elegant and structured like the piece she'd just attempted. But then it began to change. The melody shifted into something that sounded familiar, like songs she'd heard her grandmother sing. As Brenner played, Maria Elena felt something stirring in her chest. This wasn't just music, it was a bridge between two worlds. Her world and this world. He finished and looked at her expectantly. It's beautiful, she whispered, but I don't know if I can learn something that complex in 4 weeks. You won't be learning it alone. I would work with you every day. We would practice together until you feel ready. Every day? But I have to work. I need my job to pay rent. How much do you make at the music store? She felt embarrassed to say. Not much. About $1,200 a month. Brenner was quiet for a moment. If you agree to do this, the orchestra will pay you $3,000 for the performance. That should give you time to focus on the music without worrying about money. $3,000. That was more money than she'd ever seen at once. It would pay her rent for months and maybe even let her take some real piano lessons. Why are you doing this? She asked. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Brenner sat back down across from her. When I was young, growing up in Austria, my grandmother was Mexican. She came to Europe as a young woman and married my grandfather. She was a beautiful musician, played guitar and sang the most incredible folk songs, but she never performed publicly. The classical music world wasn't ready for someone like her. Maria Elena felt chills run down her arms. She used to tell me that music has no borders, that the heart speaks the same language in every culture, but she never got the chance to prove it. She died when I was 15, and I always regretted that the world never heard her gift. He looked directly into Maria Elena's eyes. When I heard you play today, I heard her music in your fingers. This is bigger than just a concert, Maria Elena. This is about showing people that beautiful music can come from anywhere, from anyone. She felt tears starting to form. What if I fail? What if I freeze up on stage or forget everything? Then you fail beautifully, he said simply. But I don't think you will. You have your grandmother's music in your blood, just like I have mine. Together we can honor both of them. Maria Elena looked at the sheet music spread across the piano, then back at Brenner's kind but determined face. This was crazy. This was impossible. This was the scariest thing anyone had ever asked her to do. Okay, she heard herself say. I'll do it. Brenner smiled wider than she'd seen since meeting him. Excellent. We start tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And Maria Elena, yes, bring comfortable shoes. We have a lot of work to do. Maria Elena's alarm went off at 6 in the morning, but she was already awake. She'd been staring at the ceiling for an hour, her mind racing with melodies and doubts. Today was her first real practice session with Maestro Brenner, and she felt like she might throw up from nerves. She got dressed and made coffee with shaking hands. The sheet music Brenner had given her was spread across her tiny kitchen table, covered in pencil marks where she'd tried to write in fingering suggestions. She'd stayed up until 2 in the morning trying to work through the first page. The piece was unlike anything she'd ever attempted. It started classical and proper, but then it twisted into something that reminded her of her grandmother's lullabies. The rhythm changed. The melody became more free and flowing, like it was dancing instead of marching. Her phone buzzed with a text from her boyfriend Carlos. "Still can't believe you're doing this crazy thing. Call me later." Carlos didn't understand. He thought she was chasing an impossible dream, that she should focus on practical things like getting a better job or taking classes at the community college. He'd been supportive when piano was just a hobby, but now that it might actually lead somewhere, he seemed worried. She walked to the symphony hall through the early morning quiet. The building looked different in the soft light, less intimidating and more welcoming. The security guard from yesterday recognized her and smiled. "You're the piano girl," he said. "Maestro Brenner left word that you're expected. Good luck." She found her way to the rehearsal room where Brenner was already waiting with coffee and pastries from an expensive-looking bakery. "How did you sleep?" he asked, studying her face. "Not much," she admitted. "Good. That means you're taking this seriously. Eat something, then we begin." For the next 3 hours, Brenner pushed her harder than she'd ever been pushed. He made her play passages over and over until her fingers cramped. When she made a mistake, he didn't just correct it. He made her understand why it was wrong and how to fix it permanently. "Your left hand is lazy," he said after she stumbled through a difficult section. "It wants to take shortcuts. In music, there are no shortcuts. Only practice and more practice," but he wasn't cruel about it. When she got frustrated and wanted to quit, he'd sit down and play the passage himself, showing her how it should sound. His hands moved across the keys like they were having a conversation with the piano. "Feel how the music breathes," he told her. "Don't just play the notes, play the spaces between the notes too." By noon, her hands ached and her head was spinning with new information. But something amazing was happening. She could feel herself getting better. Not just technically, but musically. The piece was starting to make sense. "That's enough for today," Brenner said. "Go home, rest your hands, and let your brain process what we've done. Tomorrow we work on the folk melody section." Maria Elena gathered her things, but as she reached the door, Brenner called after her. "Maria, Elena, you did well today. Better than I expected." She floated home on that compliment. But the next few days brought new challenges. Word had gotten out somehow that Brenner was working with an unknown pianist for the season finale. The orchestra members started showing up early to rehearsals, curious about this mystery soloist. Most of them were polite but distant. She could feel them watching her during breaks, whispering among themselves. A few were openly friendly. The first violinist, Patricia, brought her tea and asked about her background. But others seemed less welcoming. "I heard she's never had formal training," she overheard one of the cellists saying. "This is turning into a publicity stunt." "Brenner's lost his mind," another replied. "This is the season finale, not amateur hour." Their words stung, but they also motivated her. She started arriving an hour early every day to practice before Brenner showed up. She stayed late, working on difficult passages until the janitor had to ask her to leave. The music store where she worked wasn't happy about her new schedule. Her manager, Mr. Peterson, had been understanding at first, but as she requested more time off, he grew irritated. "Look, Maria Elena, I like you, but this isn't fair to the other employees. They're having to cover your shifts constantly." "I know, Mr. Peterson, I'm sorry. It's just for a few more weeks." "A few more weeks of what? Playing pretend musician? You have a good job here. Don't throw it away for some fantasy." His words echoed what Carlos had been saying. Even her parents, who had been supportive, were starting to worry. "Mija," her mother said over dinner, "what happens after this concert? Will this maestro give you a job? Will you be able to pay rent when he die?" "I don't know, Mama, but I have to try." Her father, who rarely spoke about emotions, put his hand on her shoulder. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said quietly, "but she would also want you to be practical." The pressure was building from all sides, but the worst part was the doubt creeping into her own mind. During particularly difficult practice sessions when her fingers couldn't keep up with what her brain wanted them to do, she wondered if everyone was right. Maybe she was being foolish. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into preparation, everything fell apart. She was working on the most challenging section, where the classical melody transformed into a folk song her grandmother used to sing. Her fingers kept tripping over themselves, and nothing sounded right. Brenner stopped her for the 10th time in 5 minutes. "What is wrong today? You are playing like a machine, not like a musician." "I can't get it," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "My hands won't do what I want them to do." "Your hands are fine. It is your head that is the problem." "What do you mean?" Brenner sat down beside her on the piano bench. "You are trying to play this music like it belongs to someone else. Like you are copying something instead of creating it." "But I am copying it." "You wrote it. I wrote the notes. But the music, the real music, that has to come from you." He played the problematic passage, and she heard the difference immediately. When he played it, it sounded like a conversation between the classical world and her grandmother's world. When she played it, it sounded like she was trying to speak 2 languages at once and failing at both. "Close your eyes," he said. "Don't look at the music. Think about your grandmother singing in the kitchen. Think about how that made you feel." She closed her eyes and let the memory wash over her, her grandmother's voice warm and rich, filling their small house with songs about love and loss and hope, the smell of fresh tortillas and the sound of laughter from the living room where her cousins played. "Now play," Brenner said softly. This time, her fingers found the melody without thinking about technique or precision. The classical structure was still there, but now it was infused with something deeper, the soul of those kitchen concerts, the warmth of her grandmother's love. When she finished, she opened her eyes to find Brenner smiling. "That," he said, "is what I have been waiting to hear. That is the music that will stop the concert." "Stop the concert?" "In the best possible way," he said. "When people hear music that real, that honest, everything else disappears. The world stops to listen." For the first time since this whole adventure began, Maria Elena started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this. The day of the concert arrived with gray clouds hanging low over the city. Maria Elena woke up to the sound of rain tapping against her apartment window, and for a moment, she thought it might be a sign that the universe was telling her to stay home. Her dress hung on the closet door, a simple black gown that her friend Rosa had loaned her. Rosa was a waitress at an upscale restaurant and had borrowed it from a co-worker who was about the same size. It was beautiful, but when Maria Elena tried it on the night before, it was too long and a little loose in the shoulders. "You look like a real musician," Rosa had said, helping her pin up the hem with safety pins. "Just don't trip on stage." Now sitting on the edge of her bed at 7 in the morning, Maria Elena wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Her phone had been buzzing all morning with messages. Carlos had texted 3 times asking if she was sure about this. Her parents had sent a photo of the candle they'd lit at church for her success. Even Mr. Peterson from the music store had wished her luck, though he'd also reminded her that her shift started at 9 tomorrow morning. She made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and tried to eat a piece of toast, but her stomach felt like it was full of butterflies doing somersaults. The sheet music sat on her kitchen table, every page memorized by now, but she flipped through it anyway, her fingers moving silently through the passages. At 10 o'clock, she walked to the symphony hall through the steady rain. The building looked different today, bigger somehow, more important. There were trucks parked outside, and people in black clothing rushed around carrying equipment and flowers. Inside, the lobby was buzzing with activity. Workers hung banners and polished the already spotless floors. Through the open doors to the main concert hall, she could see rows and rows of red velvet seats, all empty but waiting. "There you are," came Brenner's voice behind her. She turned to see him looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. His usually perfect hair was slightly messy, and he was carrying 3 different folders of sheet music. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrified," she answered honestly. "Good. If you weren't scared, I would be worried." He guided her toward the backstage area. "We have a small problem." Maria Elena's heart sank. "What kind of problem?" "Nothing you need to worry about." Some of the board members are having second thoughts about tonight's program. They think perhaps we are taking too big a risk with such an important concert. Maybe they're right, she said quietly. Brenner stopped walking and turned to face her. Maria Elena, look at me. Do you remember what we discovered 2 weeks ago? When you stopped trying to be perfect and started being yourself? She nodded. That is what tonight is about. Not perfection. Not impressing rich people in expensive suits. Tonight is about sharing something real with people who need to hear real music. But as they walked deeper into the backstage area, Maria Elena could feel the tension in the air. Orchestra members were warming up in practice rooms, and she caught fragments of conversations as they passed. I heard the Times critic is here tonight, someone said. Did you see the crowd gathering outside? There are protesters. Protesters? Maria Elena asked Brenner. His jaw tightened. Some people think that mixing classical music with folk traditions is inappropriate. They believe classical music should remain pure and unchanged. They reached her dressing room, a small space with a mirror surrounded by bright lights and a comfortable chair. Someone had left flowers on the table with a note. For courage. Break a leg. Patricia. The first violinist had been nothing but kind to her throughout the preparation. I need to check on some things, Brenner said. You rest, warm up your hands, and try to stay calm. We have 2 hours until showtime. After he left, Maria Elena sat in front of the mirror and barely recognized herself. The borrowed dress, the stage makeup Rosa had taught her to apply. The hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked like she belonged in this world, but she didn't feel like it. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. A man in an expensive suit entered, someone she'd never seen before. He had the kind of confidence that came with money and power. Miss Vasquez, I'm Richard Hartwell, chairman of the orchestra's board of directors. Her mouth went dry. She'd heard this name whispered in worried tones by the orchestra members. I wanted to speak with you before tonight's performance, he continued, closing the door behind him. I'm sure you understand that tonight's concert is extremely important to our organization. We have major donors in the audience, critics from national publications, and our entire season depends on the success of this evening. Yes, sir, she managed to say. I want you to know that I have nothing personal against you. By all accounts, you're a talented young woman. But I'm concerned that Maestro Brenner may have made a decision based on sentiment rather than practical considerations. Maria Elena felt like he'd slapped her. I've been practicing every day for a month. I'm sure you have. But there's a difference between practicing and being ready for a performance of this magnitude. If you feel uncertain at all, if you think there's any chance you might not be able to deliver what's expected, now would be the time to step aside. We have backup plans. Backup plans? A pianist who's performed with us before. Someone reliable. Someone who wouldn't put our reputation at risk. The room felt like it was spinning. Are you asking me not to perform? I'm asking you to consider what's best for everyone involved. After he left, Maria Elena sat staring at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked small and lost in the big chair. Maybe Hartwell was right. Maybe she was in over her head. Another knock came, gentler this time. Maria Elena? It's me. Brenner entered to find her with tears in her eyes. What happened? He asked immediately. She told him about Hartwell's visit, about the backup pianist, about feeling like she didn't belong. Brenner's face grew dark with anger. That man has no right to speak to you that way. He knows nothing about music, only about money and politics, boy. But what if he's right? What if I embarrass everyone? Brenner pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of her. Let me tell you something about embarrassment. 25 years ago, when I first came to this country, I conducted a small orchestra in Pennsylvania. I spoke terrible English, I didn't understand American customs, and I made many mistakes. He leaned forward. One night I was conducting a piece I'd never performed before. Halfway through, I lost my place completely. I had to stop the entire orchestra and start over. The audience laughed. The critics wrote terrible reviews. I wanted to quit and go back to Europe. What did you do? I learned that the only real failure is not trying. Everything else is just practice. He stood up and walked to the flowers Patricia had sent. These flowers are from musicians who believe in you. I believe in you. Your grandmother believed in you before you even knew you could play piano. But what if I freeze up? What if I can't remember anything? Then you remember what your grandmother taught you. You remember that music comes from the heart, not from perfect technique. You remember that 1,200 people are going to hear something tonight they've never heard before. the sound of two worlds coming together in harmony. He checked his watch. 1 hour until showtime. Are you ready to show them what real music sounds like? Maria Elena looked at herself in the mirror one more time. The scared girl looking back at her was still there, but behind her eyes she could see something else growing. Something that looked like determination. Yes, she said, and for the first time all day she meant it. The lights in the concert hall dimmed, and Maria Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She stood in the wings watching 1,200 people settle into their seats. The audience was a sea of elegant evening wear and expectant faces, all turned toward the stage where she would soon sit alone at the grand piano. 5 minutes, a stagehand whispered as he passed by. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see her parents in the 4th row. Her mother wore the blue dress she'd bought for Maria Elena's high school graduation, and her father had on his one good suit. They looked nervous but proud, craning their necks to take in the grandeur of the concert hall. Carlos was sitting beside them, fidgeting with his program. He'd surprised her by showing up, even after all his doubts about this whole adventure. Next to him sat Rosa, who gave her a thumbs up when their eyes met. The orchestra members took their places on stage, a coordinated ballet of musicians carrying instruments and adjusting music stands. Patricia, the first violinist, caught sight of Maria Elena in the wings and smiled encouragingly. Brenner appeared at her elbow, looking calm despite the magnitude of the evening. He was dressed in his formal conducting attire, the long-tailed coat that made him look like he'd stepped out of another century. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. "Like I might throw up." She answered honestly. "Perfect. That means you care." From the stage she could hear the orchestra warming up, a symphony of scales and scattered melodies that somehow sounded beautiful even in its chaos. Soon that chaos would organize itself around her playing. "Remember," Brenner said, "you are not performing for the critics or the board members or anyone who doubts you belong here. You are playing for your grandmother. For every person who ever had a dream but never got the chance to pursue it. You are playing for the music itself." The house lights went down completely and the audience fell silent. Maria Elena felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to either fly or fall. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcer's voice, "please welcome the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra and Maestro Heinrich Brenner." Brenner squeezed her shoulder once, then walked onto the stage. The audience applauded politely as he took his place at the conductor's podium. He raised his baton, and the orchestra began the opening piece, a classical selection that would warm up the audience before her performance. As the familiar melodies filled the hall, Maria Elena tried to calm her racing thoughts. She closed her eyes and thought about all the hours of practice, all the times Brenner had made her play passages until they were perfect, all the moments when the music had felt like it was flowing directly from her heart through her fingers. The opening piece ended to enthusiastic applause. Now came the moment she'd been preparing for. "Our next selection," Brenner's voice carried clearly through the hall, "is a world premiere, a piece that bridges classical tradition with the rich musical heritage of Mexico. Tonight we are honored to present this composition with guest soloist Maria Elena Vasquez." The applause was polite but uncertain. She could feel the audience's curiosity, their skepticism, their willingness to be impressed or disappointed. She walked onto the stage, her legs somehow carrying her despite feeling like they were made of water. The stage lights were brighter than she'd expected, making the audience beyond them fade into darkness. The piano waited for her, its polished surface reflecting the lights like still water. She sat on the bench and adjusted her dress, her hands finding their positions on the keys. The orchestra was silent behind her, waiting for her to begin. Brenner stood at his podium, baton ready, his eyes locked on hers with complete confidence. This was it. Everything she'd worked for, dreamed of, feared, and hoped for, came down to the next few minutes. She took a deep breath and began. The opening was pure classical music, elegant, structured, precisely what the audience expected to hear in this hall. Her fingers moved over the keys with the technical skill Brenner had drilled into her. Each note clear and purposeful. She could feel the orchestra joining her, their instruments weaving around her melody like old friends having a conversation. For the first few minutes, everything went exactly as rehearsed. The audience relaxed into familiar territory. The board members nodded their approval, and Maria Elena felt her confidence growing with each measure. But then came the transition, the moment where the classical structure began to shift into something else entirely. As the melody evolved, Maria Elena felt something unexpected happening. The music was taking her somewhere she hadn't planned to go. Instead of playing exactly what was written on the page, she began to hear her grandmother's voice weaving through the notes. The folk melody that Brenner had written began to transform under her fingers. She found herself adding small embellishments, tiny changes that made the music more personal, more real. It was still recognizably the piece they'd rehearsed, but now it carried something deeper. Behind her, she sensed the orchestra adjusting to her interpretation. Brenner's conducting became more fluid, following her lead rather than directing it. This was becoming a conversation between all of them, a musical dialogue that was happening in real time. As the piece moved into its most challenging section, Maria Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of playing the transitional passage exactly as written, she began to improvise, weaving in a melody her grandmother had hummed while making tortillas on Sunday mornings. The melody was simple but heartbreaking, a song about leaving home, about missing the people you love, about carrying their memory with you wherever you go. It flowed naturally from the classical framework, like it had always belonged there. She could feel the change in the hall immediately. The polite, reserved energy of the audience shifted into something more focused, more attentive. People stopped checking their programs and started really listening. The improvisation was so unexpected, so personal and raw, that Brenner found himself lowering his baton. The orchestra, following his lead, began to play more softly, then gradually fell silent, leaving only Maria Elena's piano filling the vast space. For nearly 2 minutes, she played alone, not the composition they'd rehearsed, but something that came directly from her heart. The melody spoke of her grandmother's dreams, her own journey from cleaning offices to sitting on the stage, the bridge between the world she came from and the world she was entering. In the audience, her mother was crying. Carlos sat with his mouth slightly open, finally understanding what she'd been trying to tell him about music. Even the critics who had come prepared to write dismissive reviews found themselves pulled into the emotional current of her playing. When she finally returned to the written composition, for the closing passage, the orchestra rejoined her with a sensitivity and warmth that transformed the entire piece. They were no longer just playing notes on a page. They were telling a story together. The final chord rang out in the hall and faded into absolute silence. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity. No one moved. Maria Elena sat at the piano, her hand still resting on the keys, hardly believing what had just happened. Then Brenner began to clap. The sound of his applause broke the spell, and suddenly the entire hall erupted. People jumped to their feet, applauding with an intensity that made the chandeliers seem to vibrate. The orchestra members were clapping, some of them wiping their eyes. Maria Elena stood on shaking legs and turned to face the audience. Through the stage lights, she could see people on their feet, faces bright with emotion. Her parents were crying and clapping. Rosa was cheering like she was at a baseball game. But what moved her most was seeing Maestro Brenner. The man who had taken a chance on her, who had believed in her when no one else did, was applauding with tears streaming down his face. In that moment, Maria Elena understood what he had meant about music stopping a concert. Sometimes when something real and honest happens on stage, everything else becomes unimportant. The only thing that matters is the connection between the music and the human heart. The applause continued for 5 full minutes, but for Maria Elena, time had stopped entirely. She had found her voice and the world had listened.